Welcome back to Crosstalks. For those of you joining us for the first time, Crosstalks is a collaboration between Stockholm University and KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. We've just had an intense panel discussion about the causes and effects of and mankind's presumed dependence on war. If you missed out, just look under previous talks on this website. Also, a quick reminder, you have the unique opportunity to ask questions directly of our studio guests towards the end of the show. To join us on the air, simply call us on Skype, where our name is Crosstalks TV, and that is also our name on Twitter. Among the political ideas battling it out in the 20th century, democracy was arguably the most successful. But today, the practice of democracy seems to be challenged in countries we had thought stable. So what does it take to create a successful democracy? How fragile is the democratic system? And is it a necessity to revive the idea and practice of democracy in the 21st century? Joining us here in the studio are Drude Dahlerup, Professor of Political Science, Stockholm University, Sonja Buchegger, Associate Professor of Computer Science at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, and Agné, Associate Professor of Political Science, Stockholm University. Drude, how would you describe the status of democracy as a political idea in the world today?
Well, it's very important that you start with some kind of definition of what democracy is, right? Mm-hmm. And usually you would say democracy is about fair and free elections, but also about civil liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and of course minority rights. And if you use this quite simple definition, for instance, Freedom House, the American database, would say there's about 100 countries in the world who can be labeled democracy, and that this has increased during the last 40 years, especially in the 1990s, right? But at the same time, you also have decline of democracy, as you said yourself. And I think the greatest mistake is to believe that democracy is made once and for all. Even here in Scandinavia, we sometimes think that, right? Democracy can also decline. It's something you have to fight for every day, I would say. But we absolutely have countries who are declining in some kind of democracy. Turkey, for instance, in terms of freedom of speech. You have the problem of Hungary. I mean, even in European countries, we have problems, of course. So never believe that democracy is done once and for all.
So perhaps people who live in democracies are too focused on the election part and think too little about the civil liberties because those we tend to take for granted.
That could absolutely be true, yes. Absolutely.
And that's actually a terrifying thought, given how much we're trading those away for other reasons, for other purposes, such as gaining security.
Are you talking about surveillance and saying, yes, it's a big paradox that, in fact, we are doing more and more surveillance to protect democracy. At the same time, this surveillance is really deteriorating democracy. It's going far, far, far creeping into our civil liberties, I would say.
Hans, I'd like to ask you the same question. What's your thinking about the status of democracy as a political idea and practice today?
I mean, if we think about the world as a whole, that is really a big place, and there's a lot of things one can say about it. And if I try to just say what comes up to my mind immediately, I see two things. One is confusion, and another is hope. I think there are so many things that we need to address from a democratic perspective in the world today, but which we do not know how to address. I think about migration, about whether they should be inside or outside the countries from which they come. I think about the struggle over the meaning of democracy between the EU and Russia in the crisis of Ukraine. I think about the Arab Spring and how such a promising thing can suddenly end up in planned mass executions, etc. I think all of these events are examples of things that we would like to address in democratic terms. We would like to say, how should we deal with them democratically? But we don't really know, and here I speak like we of humanity, we don't really know what democracy means in relation to those concepts. And that confusion I see somewhere across the world quite generally. But then at the same time, there is hope, in the sense that even if we don't really know what we mean by saying we want to solve this in a democratic way, there is still so many people who continue to cling to this term. So that in some sense it does capture a very important intuition. Even if we are not sure whether general elections or civil rights are the really fundamental fundamental thing here. We think that perhaps self-determination or quest for freedom, or that would be my favorite values that I underpin democracy with, are something that we can try to struggle for by using this term. And that, I think, is a big sign of hope to make the world a better place by using
the
this
previous
term.
panel, when we were talking about war and methods and instances for controlling war, talked about international law and the legal system as one, I guess, mediator within the democratic societies. Maybe we should add that to a functioning legal system as a special case of the civil liberties, so as foundation of democracy, also internationally.
I buy that one.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't?
No, I wouldn't. No, I would actually think it's useful to try to free the concept of democracy from the ideas of rule of law. Not that rule of law is bad, but because there are so many contexts in the world where rule of law has such a limited role, and we still want to think about those contexts. Like think about the internet, or think about the international political system that is not regulated by law. Well, we would still like to lead action by the democratic ideal. So if we can think of democracy even beyond the law, I think we have an even better equipment to
Sonja, you come at this from a slightly different angle, but already we've touched on your field so much. You work with communication technology. From what we've seen in recent struggles for democracy, for example, during the Arab Spring, this is always the example. A lot of headlines revolved around social media. I think more profoundly, access to digital communications became very important. Why do you think that access to and the ability to use social communications or media communication tools played such an important role there?
There's actually a bit of a debate about that. So it's a kind of a Western narrative that social media made the Arab Spring.
Yes.
It was vital to some extent and mainly used by young people. And we know that a lot of communication preceded actual events, so there is a causal connection there. But also traditional media was very important, like BBC or Al Jazeera being there and spreading images and putting pressure onto the international audience, so that local actions were limited. But again, when it worked, then images and information about where to gather spread across the social media. So that was important too. When it didn't work, then of course you lose something you depend on, and then you have to go to other means, like they did with faxes, for example.
So I guess organizing would be one aspect of
Yes.
it, but also bearing witness to what is happening.
And spreading information
on the
in a very easy and fast way.
Yes, absolutely.
I have a research project now supported by the Swedish Research Council on women in the Arab Spring. And I do agree with you, but there's one more aspect interesting is that in a very patriarchal society where women, as we know, have problems to move in the public sphere, and we have lots of sexual harassment, suddenly the new social media is making it possible to be in the public sphere without risking your body. And that is a very important aspect that we don't think about, right?
No. That's fascinating. Sonja, you're working on developing a secure alternative to mainstream social media services. Can you tell us about that project?
Yeah, so I see the main problem with current web-based social media that they are centralized and in the hand of a single provider, some commercial provider. And that means all our data is also collected centrally and can be mined, not just what we put online ourselves, but what others put about us or just our behavior when we are online and whom we talk to and so on. And so with this central collection, it can be mined, it can be used for targeted advertising, or it can be lost, it can be leaked either accidentally or some hacker gets in, or it can be sold. And so our solution to this is to take away this single provider and decentralize the whole system and use cryptographic means to give control back to the individual users. And that, I would say, is also the biggest need that we fulfill here, to give control to the users so that they can decide who should be able to access what of their information. And and also give them some resilience. So if a country can just turn off Twitter, like we saw in Turkey, this is very hard to do in a decentralized system.
So centralized equals compromised in some sense, or structurally speaking. If it's centralized, somebody has control.
Yes,
the powers that be,
and you
whoever
can draw
they are.
inference from all collected data. So it's easier to infer. For example, we know that it's easy to infer that someone is gay just from Facebook data, and this can be dangerous.
And of course, in some places that is very dangerous. Why is it important to be able to use social media tools securely? Is it important for everybody? Is it important for me, or is it mostly important if I'm organizing, let's say, a revolution in a dictatorship?
Well, then, of course, it's very important. But also, just as a regular user, we are being online more and more, and we reveal more about ourselves. And it's getting increasingly personal. So in social networks, then we talk to our friends about personal stuff, and we also want to protect, for example, our health information. Or so people nowadays go online to book a flight. They don't go to the travel agency, and it's offline. So we do a lot of activities online, and if you are able to put everything we do together, which is a large chunk of our activities, and have inference on that, which can also be wrong. So you can also be classified wrongly and persecuted, for example. So I think there is a great need for secure social media. So.
In conversations about democracy, transparency is often a virtue. How can it be a threat to democracy that all of our lives are entirely transparent?
I think it's a question of power. So if we want our authorities to be transparent, so we want to know what's going on. We have Offentlighetsprincipen in Sweden, for example. And so there's also this
public access
to information by public agents. And there is also, we talked about surveillance before, but there is also the notion of inverse surveillance, so that the citizens can observe and see what is done by authorities. So it's a power question. Who can see what from whom?
You're nodding.
But of course, we have another paradox here. Because in some way, well, I agree with all you're saying here, but also it's a very democratic tool that much more people can get into with their opinions into the public discussion by the way of the new social media. But of course, we also have the dark side of it, and we know it also here from Sweden, that there are lots of harassment, especially about women politicians, right? And kind of anti-feminist trend, and people are writing. Some people are sitting. I'm sure people get empowered by saying all those awful things, you know. But at the same time, people are saying now things that you usually say after 5 beers in the bar, right? And you've suddenly put it out in the total open. And it was very interesting. There was a TV program about where they tried to find some of those men, usually men who are sitting, harassing women journalists. And it turned out that they didn't even know who they were, but they felt empowered by, I gave them a touch here. But it is a paradox that now you can really say anything and people feel very hurt about it, especially if you say, I know where your children are going to school, right? It's it's pretty awful.
So I think anonymous communication can also be misused, but if you have a secure way of controlling access to your information, then I can make sure that people do not know where my children go to school, or where the women are located, so that if they receive some threats, they cannot be tracked down and actually physically threatened. Very good.
Joining us via Skype from The Hague is Kristen, Director of Global Programs at the organization IDEA, that's the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Welcome to Crosstalks.
Thank you very much.
Kristen, you've studied, among other things, women's political participation in Latin America. What did you find?
Well, thanks for that question. Yeah, we've done a lot of research on the issue, and we also have programs on the ground in Latin American countries that work on this issue. I guess if I had to start out by highlighting a key factor, it would be, first of all, that progress has happened. Progress is possible. That decisions made today can make a difference in terms of women getting elected or not, or joining the political process or not. That is to say, it's not just a matter of letting nature take its course, but there are policies that can be put in place and make a difference. If we look at Latin America, for instance, where currently 25% of parliamentarians in the region are women, that's the highest figure in the world. No other region has gotten to that 25% mark. And it's also a big improvement over the last couple of decades. I don't think anyone would have necessarily predicted it. If we look at that figure, and then we also look at some of the differences, because there are a lot of variations between countries in the region, I think we can take away a few quick lessons. And one would be, as I said before, policies matter. Policies like quotas, for instance, while not a panacea, they can make a difference in terms of getting more women elected, having councils or parliaments be more gender balanced, as long as they're well written without loopholes, as long as they are enforced, as long as they're compatible with the electoral system. So quotas make a difference, for instance, but then there are a lot of other factors at play that still require a lot more work, working with political parties so that they're more gender-friendly in their policies and gender-friendly in terms of their lists and their candidacies. Working more with the media, which is something also that we've seen big imbalances in terms of media coverage, how women are covered when they're running for office and the amount of coverage they get. And then campaign finance is another thing that we also see big imbalances. So I'd say in Latin America there's been a lot of progress, but certainly there's a lot of work left to be done.
And that a lot of that's applicable, of course, to other regions. Drude, you've also recently written a book about the struggle to make our governing systems more gender equal. Does this all sound familiar? Is everywhere the same? Let's start there.
Oh no, there are big differences, as was said here, between various regions. I wrote this book, which is called Breaking Male Dominance in Old Democracies. And this is a longitudinal, in-depth study of the last 100 years, what has really happened. Because I don't like when some people say, well, nothing has happened, and other people say we have gender equality. So we're trying together with people, I'm editing the book together with Monique Leinhardt, and we see what are the trajectories, what are the steps taken here. For instance, when did you get the first women defense minister? When was women allowed to have ambitions? I mean, we didn't have any women leaders almost in the 1960s here in the Scandinavian countries. And I'm calling this Scandinavian very, very long incremental track. The incremental track, the step-by-step track. And when I go around the world and I do a lot of consultancy in other countries, and they ask me, how long time did it take you, right? Then I have to answer, it took us 100 years. We're celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage. Whereas the fast track model is Latin America, Argentina, but it's also many post-conflict countries. So I have been a consultant in Bhutan, in Sierra Leone, in Cambodia, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and some of those countries are, not all of them, but some of them are making historical jumps which we have never done. For instance, Senegal going from 22 to 43% overnight. Argentina is also a fast-track country. So now, of course, the next book is going to be Breaking Male Dominance in New Democracies. What does it mean when you make this kind of quick jump in terms of robustness, sustainability, and other things? I'm saying that the Scandinavian countries is not the only model anymore out there. There are fast-track models which we have never tried. And Latin America is really the region where things are happening. I do agree with that. But the Arab states too.
Well, in old democracies that haven't reached a fully representational or a gender balance that represents the population, are there strategies or insights from these fast-track countries that we could apply in, for instance, the Nordic countries?
Well, some of them are, of course, many of them are applying some kind of quota systems. There are many different quota systems, and that is one of the things I'm advising people on. There are different quota systems. But yes, we are more kind of well, let's see, the development comes by itself more or less. But I feel also a kind of impatience in the Nordic countries now, like we see in Norway when they had made a quota for women on the board of the companies. So things are really moving, and we have a new discourse in the world's UN is a very good example of that, that to have a full democracy, you have to have the participation of all parts of society, women, minorities, young people, etc. So you're going from having a definition of democracy with more like the how you do it, the structures, to include in the conception of democracy the who. We do not rely on old men having all the power in politics. Now we have to have a more broad diversity.
So as human rights are becoming more central a value in the international stage, also in the idea of what democracy is, it becomes about the distribution of power across a society.
Absolutely.
More. Kristen, what sort of ideas or issues are you most interested in now regarding democracy in as ideal and practice?
Well, there's our teams at International IDEA are working on quite a few different issues, but I guess I would highlight a couple. One would be, for instance, the question of money in politics. And I bring that up because it cuts across not just new or emerging democracies, but also what you might call the older or more consolidated democracies. And the issue of looking at how is it that money plays a role, how is it influencing politics? And what we're finding, of course, is that it contributes to a less balanced playing field, that candidates with deep pockets are able to beat candidates who don't have the resources, that it can have an impact, of course, in terms of policy making once a candidate's elected with support from donors, and also contributing to a sense of citizen discontent and disconnect with politics that we find very worrisome. And we've taken the research actually a bit farther too, not just in terms of political finance regulation, which is important, but even looking at how also this globalization phenomenon, speaking of kind of the dirty side of globalization, but how is it that illicit networks or kind of these transnational criminal mafias in some case are trying to get into the political game and trying to influence policy and politics through money. And so we're doing some research on that in terms of Latin America, and we're working on policy reform in Latin America, looking at where has that influence happened and what type of policies can be put in place to protect politics from these illicit networks.
So money in politics, discontent with the political system, and criminal networks trying to access the political process, some huge threats. Would you guys like to add something? Hans?
The huge threats against democracy, I will continue to speaking about globalization, but emphasize a double-edged sword here. That on the one hand, of course, it is something that may challenge and undermine the way we have practiced democracy until now. On the other hand, at the same time, it is one way to bring democracy into spaces that have never been thought of possible to democratize. For instance, the boundaries of nation states. How can they be drawn in a democratic way? We've always taken for granted that democracy is something that can be practiced only within a given state. First you establish the state, and then you can democratize it. While the greater awareness of their living people on the other side of the border, and that they may be worth the same respect as the people within my own state, may take us into a situation where we can, for instance, establish border issues in a democratic way, or we can move on in our, so to say, in our possibilities to imagine democracy in other spaces that we did not look upon before.
Could you be a little bit more concrete? Did I just hear you say that you suggest as a sort of utopian model, at least for solving, for instance, border disputes, letting the people living on each side vote?
I think that is one potential way of dealing with border disputes, right? If we think of the definition that Drude presented to begin with, I think that democracy means that in case people disagree about something, then we bring everyone into the same group and let the majority decide. And basically, it's not unthinkable that we could do the same thing with borders. Of course, that means that we may have to scale up the political unit from the nation state, perhaps to the regional level, and perhaps even to the global level, in order to have a legitimate decision on what states there should be. That may seem utopian, but on the other hand, there are really severe problems that we have to address problems that we would not like to deny today. There are many people who are not satisfied with the borders as they are drawn today. A lot of Russian-speaking minorities in Ukraine today are not really happy with those borders. Or we can take it to in the globalization debate. There's a lot of laborers that are not really happy with the borders of their countries because they think that the financial power have moved somewhere else, and they would like to have voting power, even if they are, or the financial decision makers are located in London City or in Washington or somewhere else.
You're blowing my mind. Are you not describing a world of utter chaos?
I think that we do have these problems today, that people are not satisfied with the borders that have been drawn by war or by historical circumstances. And it's our duty as citizens of today to listen carefully to them too, to not simply listen to those people who have been able to establish the nation states that they want and who can use these enormous powers that we invest in the nation state. Remember, the nation state, that is the one organization that we have equipped with the power to actually to kill or to use legitimate violence. And why should we only privilege the people who happen to be satisfied with their nation states? There are a lot of people who are not satisfied with it, and to pay equal respect to them, I think, is what democracy demands today, even if it will require some kind of new institutions beyond the state.
That's very interesting. Drude, Dahlerup.
Yes, I agree to add the principle of self-determination to our discussion about democracy. You know, the first instance was in fact in Denmark. I originally come from Denmark, right? It was in 1920. The war, after the First World War, the people of the southern part of Denmark and Germany had the right to vote whether they wanted this commune want to go to Denmark and this commune want to go to Germany. And that was the first time in the history that this kind of peace accord had the self-determination in it. And I think we have it in our minds now that self-determination is important. But at the same time, there's a lot of hypocrisy out there. Because when I hear the discussion about Ukraine, people only want referenda if they like the outcome. And they hate them if they don't like the outcome. And I think that I agree that many borders especially in Africa, of course, are drawn by the colonial powers, and there should be much more consideration about constructing other ways of having borders, or maybe not just moving them, but also giving different significance to the borders, so that they are not so important as it is now, right?
Well, yes, and these groups that are in conflict with each other quite often come with a lot of inherited. The conflicts are often inherited and go back a long ways. You would never want to be the minority in any of those referendums because you would never get your way. And sometimes the majority is not always right, as everybody who's ever been to a school should know. So there's a challenge here. I think we may have sort of reached a sort of cul-de-sac. Let's start this from the other direction. Let's not do the threats. Let's do what is required for a democracy to function. If we start with a clean slate, what do we need for democracy? Who would like to start? Hans.
I think we need people who are willing to take decisions while treating everyone equally and as free individuals. If we can only get that into the hearts and minds of people, then we have come and taken the most difficult step. By then we can continue and say perhaps in a nation-state system to have a system of general elections is a good thing, while in many other contexts general elections will not really work. We may instead need to rely on some kind of self-organizing groups who are respecting both their own members and members of other self-organizing groups. But the good start, I think, is to have the conviction inside every individual to make political decisions while treating everyone as political equals and as free and autonomous human beings. That would be, I mean, it's a start. Then,
Sorry.
Can I add something too?
Yeah,
John?
do, Kristen. Yeah.
Yeah, I would also say that we need time, that any democracy, and this gets at what Drude was speaking to earlier, needs time to develop. There's a lot of disillusionment in certain sectors, perhaps, that, oh, what's going on with the so-called Arab Spring? Why hasn't it taken hold yet? And I think that it's unfair to expect countries to go from authoritarian repressive systems to full-blown democracies in a brief period of time. And it's too bad that the international community, in many cases, is very impatient and has some sort of attention deficit disorder problem that they have to turn to the next thing if there's not all the progress right away. World Bank research, for instance, has shown that even the fastest reforming countries take a generation, take 20 or 30 years to be able to develop solid institutions. So I would just vote on the side of time and patience, as well as putting in place, and this has been alluded to by others, the right types of participation and consultation mechanisms so that citizens are able to have a voice in the design of the institutions of their country, be it through a constitutional drafting process, what types of meaningful participation is set up so that citizens themselves have a voice in drafting and, of course, approving their constitution, as well as in setting up the systems and then having the contact with their representatives.
I realize that Russia, of course, is another example of a country that has very recently, relatively recently, if you're my age, transferred to a democratic system. And some of the frustrations in the international community could absolutely be explained with this lack. That's the lack of patience. Again, Sonja, what would you add to the building blocks of democracy?
Yeah. So I'm a computer scientist and I come from the privacy angle, so I'm going to advocate for privacy here. So I think we need to have a way of communicating with other people in a safe way and spread information safely and coordinate, and so have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and association, and get organized without having fear of surveillance or that our means of communication are just turned off.
Very good. Drude?
But I think we have not to forget the old democracies and our responsibility, because we live in a much more transparent world, and many of the new democracies are looking at what happened in the old democracies. I've just been to Bhutan, this fantastic, lovely country in Himalaya, and they just have introduced democracy, and they said, democracy, you have to have political parties, but we don't like the fight. And we don't like the spin doctors, and we don't like the money getting into politics. And I said, wow, because they learned that from us, right? And I think that we have to look carefully at our democracy. And there's reason to be worried about the medialization, you can call it the money, the spin doctors. And I think that if democracy develops into a relation between the individual voter in the sofa, watching the TV, and then the political parties, and we shouldn't forget them, the political parties using a lot of money on spin doctors and all kind of focus groups to influence that individual home in the sofa, then politics will become like selling soaps. So it's very important that we have intermediate organizations, that people are organized in movements, in organizations, in trade unions. And I used to say to people, never go and vote before you have opened your mouth on the issues of the voting at the kitchen table or at your workplace. So I think that we also have to look at how we are developing and what kind of model are we giving to the new democracies.
So democracy requires a conversation where also the voters have to be part for it to be true. Otherwise, it's just some kind of beauty competition.
Absolutely, or selling soap.
Do you think it's possible to export democracy? I want to say by force, but let's say through intervention. There's this idea now with with the concept of the human rights war that atrocities can be stopped by military means. That's a separate discussion. But then after that, democracy can be introduced as a better solution for people who perhaps didn't ask for it or certainly haven't been prepared for it. Kristen, what do you say?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's possible to export. There's not a transplant sort of model that one can take from one place and whole scale implant it into another. I think just as in real estate, you say location, location, location. In the democracy world, you have to say context, context, context. And the devil's in the details many times. And something that might work perfectly well, different way that a political party has worked, or a parliament, or a citizen group in one context simply doesn't translate into another. So I think the most that you can do is try to facilitate access to different experiences of what has worked in specific contexts, give the in-depth information, and try to create linkages also between people in the newly emerging democracies with other democracies that might have more years or time under their belt, or that have been grappling with the same issues. So no, I don't think it's possible to export, but I do think it's possible to expose and to promote interaction and dialogue and discussion such that citizens in a country are able to make the decisions that works for their context.
Mm-hmm. Hans?
I think that when one is dealing with the question of whether it is possible, in a logical sense, possible to transport one system to another, it's really important to be clear about what definition of democracy one is adopting for the moment. If one is thinking about democracy simply as a particular voting mechanism or a system of having general elections, then I think it is, at least in a logical sense, possible to impose democracy by force on another country, in the sense that you can, at gunpoint, threaten people to go and vote, and if you don't vote, I shoot you. And most people will vote on that condition. So it is, in that sense, it's possible. But that, of course, is a definition that doesn't really capture what a lot of both researchers and ordinary people think or value about democracy. If one starts to read in some other ideas, such as self-determination, then it's much more difficult to say whether it is really possible to, from the outside, bring by force a system of self-determination. That, I think, would actually be something like a contradiction in terms. On the other hand, it also depends on who are the self-determining units. If we are ultimately concerned only by the self-determination of a particular nation, then there are some really contradictory implications between the idea of imposition on the one hand and self-determination on the other hand. But if we think that the self-determining subject in democratic practice is not the nation state, but say humanity, so that democracy is the right of all human beings to be self-determining, that is treating each other as political equals and free, then I believe that one could think of also using military force as one way of taking out a violent minority on the inside, or a violent dictator on the inside of a particular territory, and to do so with democratic legitimacy. So even if I just come to the end, even if we think of democracy as an idea of self-determination, if we think of the humanity as a whole as a self-determining unit, I think that it's possible to foster or promote democracy even when using power means.
Sonja, do you think that access to secure digital communications could be one sort of arena where democracy could sort of be smuggled through that example that we were talking about before? That if you provide possibilities to build the NGOs and build the unions and parties in a safe way, they will emerge.
Well, you can provide the means, and they function as a support for self-organization and self-determination, but they're not enough. So I think that there's this term of slacktivism, for example. So you share something on Facebook or tweet about it, and then you think you're an activist and you've done something, and maybe you have spread some information, but that is not enough. So it doesn't replace physical congregation and activism, but it does allow you to coordinate better and to share information without being afraid that you will be persecuted for what you're doing, or that you will be categorized in some sort of danger box and be prevented from traveling, for example.
I'm also curious about, say, a country like China, which is increasing cultural dominance, and we will see only more of that, I think, in more and more regions of the world. A country like that has demonstrated that you can have economic growth and safety, at least for some of the citizens, without being a democracy. What do you think this means for the status of democracies around the world?
Well, I think the old idea that if you have social development, you will also get democracy, China is a good example, Vietnam also, that this is not really the case. I think this theory is buried. But your question about whether you can export democracy, my answer would be no, or you cannot import democracy either. And we have very bad examples in the world, like Iraq, Afghanistan, the naivety of the old democracies, of how you can export democracy. But I also have this consideration when I work as a consultant around the world. Well, what am I really doing here? Because there's a lot of sensitivity about that I should not come here as a Westerner to say what to do. So the way, and there are lots of, I can tell you, when you go to a country, post-conflict countries, there are lots of other people in the same hotel coming from other international organizations who want to do things. So I think what we can do as consultants is to come up with different options, saying if you want this electoral system, you could do like that, or you could do like that. Not telling people what to do, but saying there are experiences around the world that this works or this doesn't work. Come up with several options, so there are some choices to be made.
Help identify questions rather than answers for beginners.
Could I respond to the China question? Is there a minute?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I think you brought up a really critical issue. And as you said, there are a lot of people banding about China as the example, the model now, and using that to question the value of democracy in the world. And I think it's a huge issue that we're still trying to understand. It's undoubtable that China has made amazing progress, really, in terms of development and reducing poverty in the country. But one has to go deeper and look at what kind of model it is. Is it sustainable, for instance? I mean, the Chinese economic development model has been developed based on urbanization, sometimes coerced urbanization, that depends on cheap labor and massive economies of scale. And I think we're starting to see some of the byproducts from that model and starting to wonder how long it will last and in what form. We see environmental degradation. We see that's not dealt with in a transparent way or covered by the media locally necessarily in a transparent way. We're seeing slowly more citizen protests. I think the figures of the number of citizen protests in the country have doubled in recent years. And we're also seeing a lot of accumulation of wealth by Chinese, a lot of inequality in that context too. And I just saw an amazing statistic that the 50 wealthiest Chinese legislators or parliamentarians have a combined net worth of 94 billion US dollars.
That's astonishing.
So that issue of accountability and the potential for corruption in a repressive society, I think, bears a lot more looking into, and people need to take these factors into account when they talk about China as a model. And again, thinking about projecting 10, 15 years down the road, what's it going to mean in terms of corruption, in terms of environment, and et cetera.
Oh, so there's a lesson that moving towards a market economy does not automatically add democracy, which is another, of course, historical idea that these are connected. I have so many questions about this, but I think so does the audience, who would like. Yes, there you go, sir. Please state your name and your affiliation.
Hi, my name is Matthias Norling, and I study here at KTH. My question is about, well, as I see it, democracy is a bit of a utopia, and as we see now globally, I mean, money is the real currency and is the real way to promote certain ways of living. And I mean, I just wanted your insight on big companies such as Apple, Google, and as well as rich persons like representatives in China who together have more money than many single countries have, and I mean their influence in the matter.
That's a great question. Thank you. So the influence of financial entities that are in some ways more powerful and sometimes also richer than states on democracy as a threat to democracy. Who would like to start? Hans?
I agree with you that there is surely a possibility that, so to say, the globalization of finance or trade is one way in which power can disappear from the original people. That is where you come from, the question. So then I just want to turn to the other perspective, that a lot of what we can do in our societies, the Swedish society or the United States society or the German society or the Finnish society, is something that is made possible by these globalization processes. We are depending on the resources for our welfare states, for our hospitals, for our TV shows on this international division of labor and on the efficiency of the international financial system. So I think that it is not a solution, in a sense, to the democratic problem of globalization, to stop globalization, but rather if we want to get further in our self-determination, whether our refers to the nation or humanity, it's rather simply to get to the places where these economic decisions are made and to get in contact and to see to that transparency is guaranteed within all these decision-making offices, and that way further democratization.
So there's a bunch of answers there, but one of them is that the democratic processes can be larger even than these entities if we work together.
Yeah.
Drude?
Yes, I agree with the question. I mean, I don't think globalization is necessarily the same as unrestricted flow of capital transactions. I mean, it's no natural law that we have this situation where the whole economy can be destabilized by financial transactions, which we ourselves have deliberated or taken away the regulation in the 1980s. And I think we have to have those kind of regulations back again. That doesn't mean that you are against globalization, but you can be against uncontrolled globalization, because not only China has this problem. I read that 85 of the richest persons in the world owe as much as half the population of the whole world.
That's insane.
I mean, that is insane, yes. And of course, we cannot have a small democracy just working on certain issues, and then you have big companies who are doing whatever they want. But we need a global democracy in some way.
But at the same time, we also have the whole digital sphere, where geography is more or less irrelevant today. Do democratic structures have any hope of controlling anything in, let's say, online, for short? Sonja?
Yeah, so just one point. So you're talking about concentration of capital and concentration of power, and you mentioned like Google. And I think in this online question, then again we have centralization, concentration of a lot of information that you can use or misuse, and as to the point of globalization, now you mentioned before that we have to realize that maybe our neighbors need to be as respected as we are. But now we're also realizing that maybe we are as little respected as our neighbors when it comes to privacy. If you look at all the revelations about the NSA spying, yes. So national borders are not a protection against being spied on, and again you have a huge agency coming together, concentrated, and I think this is a major threat.
Yeah. Let's see if we can have time. Oh, we have a Skype question. I'm sorry. Yes. Hello, Skype guest. Welcome on to Crosstalks.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Please state your name and your question, sir.
My name is Sean. I'm from Winchester in the UK. My question is, would you like to comment on the sort of corporate takeover of the US's politics over the past few decades and decisions like Citizens United and McCutcheon in the Supreme Court?
Let's see if they would. Thank you for your question, Sean.
No problem.
Does anybody have anything here, Hans?
No, I don't. No? I know too little about the case.
I'm not really sure either.
Don't feel confident now?
Yeah, just one point. Like a PhD student pointed me to this, that there's you could debate whether the NSA is actually still a governmental agency, because a lot of it has been outsourced to private companies, and it has become out of control over the political oversights, at least to some reporters. So I think that would be one factor of where. Yeah, we lose control of governments that way.
That's probably even happening in Sweden.
Sorry, yes, Kristen.
No, I was just going to respond to Sean's question, if I may.
Yes.
No, I mean, I think that's why early on I raised the issue of money in politics, which is a key area of focus for International IDEA. And all of the concerns that I raised, I think, are quite applicable to the U.S. case, where in the last 20 years, the amount of money injected into politics has increased 7-fold. So there's this massive influx of resources into politics, and you see it play out in terms of, as I said before, the unlevel playing field, especially a massive incumbency advantage. So you lose a lot of opportunities in terms of competitive elections, real debate, and in terms of turnover, which is healthy in any democratic process. I think you see it too, and there are specific cases that have been documented in terms of the undue influence that those resources can buy for certain corporations in terms of the political policy-making process. It's a huge distraction also for legislators. I've heard interviews with legislators who are part of a system that they can't control and they don't enjoy, but they see no alternative, where they'll spend hours a day fundraising, making calls to try to raise funds for their re-election campaign, sometimes just after they've been elected. So sometimes they're constantly campaigning for re-election. So I think the U.S. case, as I said, is one of those that money in politics affects not just the newer emerging democracies, but the older democracies also, and clearly is a threat that has to be discussed. There's a lot of people in the U.S. who are looking at how can this be addressed. There's even people talking about a constitutional amendment process to override the Supreme Court decision, but of course that's actually a very difficult hurdle to get over.
Difficult indeed. Thank you for this answer, Kristen. Thank you, Sean, for your question.
No problem.
There is something here. The whole language of corporate takeover of the U.S. government would have been considered incredibly incendiary not that long ago. Now we can just look at it and go, yes, this is something that we need to discuss, maybe a warning for us all. But there's also some hope, I think, in the fact that these issues are now out in the open. You know what? This is all we have time for this evening. Please give a big thanks to our guests tonight, Drude, Dahlerup, Sonja Buchegger, Kristen Sample and Hans Agné. And do join us on June the 3rd when we will be back with a new show taking a closer look at the parallel universe of the internet, what some call the dark side of the web. You do not want to miss that one. Until then, be safe and be brave.